Imperial Yeast has been up to some interesting things lately, and they recently announced a product we are super excited about. If you're familiar with Imperial Yeast, you're likely aware of their classification system. A is for ale as an A07 flagship, L is for lager as an L17 harvest, and so on. Well, they recently released the first strain in their I series, which stands for Imperialis and refers to non-GMO hybrids or derivative yeast strains developed by Imperial Yeast that have been honed to exhibit the traits today's brewers most desire. The initial offering, I-22 Capri, is a hybrid of A38 Juice and A43 Loki, two of Imperial's most popular strains for hop-forward IPA. Whether you're into this style or just enjoy juicier fermentation characteristics, you have got to try I-22 Capri. Learn more about the Imperialis project and I-22 Capri at imperialyeast.com. According to the German purity law of 1516, which is known as the Reinheitsgebot, barley is the grain used to make beer. Of course, modern brewers are by no means compelled to comply with this law, and other grains like wheat and rye are often used to produce delicious beer these days as well. However, there's another alternative grain that has received an increased attention of late. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to discuss Spelt Malt is contributor Will Lovell.
I think this ingredient is absolutely fantastic. All these heirloom varieties that have kind of been around for thousands of years that we've managed to cultivate, and we keep bringing them back and trying to find new ways to use them in our favorite beverage is fantastic. So I'm really excited to talk about this ingredient today.
Yeah, I've been brewing for a pretty long time at this point, and the first time I ever even heard of Spelt Malt was like 5 or 6 years ago, right around the time when hazy IPA was really blowing up. While I've never used or brewed with Spelt Malt myself, I've had a number of beers that I know have been made with Spelt Malt, whether they're made by commercial breweries or other home brewers, so I'm familiar with what it's supposed to do with beer at the very least. And I'm looking forward to chatting with you about this unique malted grain, as well as going over an experiment examining the impact it has on a British golden ale. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, please consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, where you make a small pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up later this month, November of 2023, Matthew Harold from the Mean Brews YouTube channel will be hanging out with patrons. If you're unfamiliar with Mean Brews, you've got to go check out that channel now. The name is not based on the host's temperament, I promise you. Matthew is a very kind person. Rather, it's in reference to the approach Matthew takes as to designing recipes. In essence, after evaluating myriad existing award-winning recipes, Matthew averages out the ingredients to develop a sort of penultimate recipe for that style. My explanation, I promise you, does not do it justice, so go check out the Mean Brews YouTube channel to see what he's up to. It's really, really cool. Matthew's going to be taking questions on Saturday, November 25th, 2023. That's the week, right? Or the Saturday right after Thanksgiving. So be sure to make your pledge of just $3 or more over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy by Friday the 24th. All past sessions are stored on our private Facebook and Patreon pages so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. Again, that's patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts that allow you to leave those ratings and reviews, we really would appreciate that as well. Not only does this help those who haven't heard of us yet to more easily find the show, but it's really nice to know what you guys think about how we're doing as well. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who offer brewers various options for high-quality, reasonably priced electric brewing rigs in various voltages and sizes. I've used their 120-volt system for 5-gallon batches, as well as their 240-volt 10-gallon setup, and both really are awesome. Clawhammer Supply puts the effort into ensuring their systems do exactly as they're intended to do in as efficient a way as possible. If you're not ready to make the jump to electric, they also sell 10 and 20-gallon brew-in-a-bag homebrewing starter kits at really good prices. Whatever it is you're looking for, do yourself a favor, visit clawhammersupply.com. We are confident you're going to love their stuff just as much as we do. All right, listener Curtis Himes, aka Turd Ferguson, wrote in with some feedback after listening to episode 299, where we shared some, quote, behind the scenes stuff about Brewlosophy. Curtis said, and this is going to make you a little bit happy, Will, I imagine. Curtis said, it took getting a large bearded Texan on the podcast for me to start my Patreon account. Sorry for the delay. For all those is holding back, I hope they can start one so we can decrease ads. Curtis doesn't like the ads, Will. I wanted to comment a little on the sample size haters you seem to get. As a practicing physician, trying to decipher industry-funded studies is somewhat of an art these days. As I work with a couple of experimental psychologists, I know that psychology in general has more in-depth statistics training than most fields, as most mental health studies are all based on patient subjective symptoms, which allows for many different statistical analyses to be able to be used to evaluate them. A good knowledge of statistics can help you figure out what's truly important because, as we know, there are lies, damn lies, in statistics. I wanted to talk a little bit about sample size. I won't get too technical because I've already had a couple of beers and frankly, I don't care. When looking at sample size to adequately power a study, you need to estimate its effect size. For example, if I was testing a parachute for someone jumping out of an airplane versus no parachute, I wouldn't need a large number of people in each group to quickly realize that the parachute group was statistically significant with regards to mortality and a closed casket funeral. The effectiveness of the parachute would be great, so you would not need a large study group. With the experiments, I think 20 people is a good number when looking at how noticeable a difference is in a beer. If a statistically significant amount of people can tell a difference, then at the very least, there is a signal that something is significant and the results are not due to chance alone. In medicine, we always say that if you have to study thousands of people to get a statistically significant result, the intervention is probably not that significant. Think of the parachute analogy. I think the same is true with beer. If you need 1 million people to be able to reach a statistically significant perceptible taste difference for a decoction mash, then it's probably not that significant. Something tells me that if the variable was the presence of dog feces in a beer, you probably wouldn't need that many tasters for everyone to agree. Will, what do you think? You big, large Texan bearded guy?
So first off, like, Kurt's my homie. We go way back. We lived in Guantanamo Bay Naval Air Station together. So his wife and my wife are good friends, and he and I are good friends. And we used to, like, it's one of those tight knit communities where we used to like hang out like basically every day, because you're on this like 45 square mile, including the water, island within an island that you can't leave. And so, like, your buddies there, just your buddies there. And so we make trips to see them every year. And so he's a good friend of mine. And so I'm glad he's on Patreon finally. In fact, he and I were talking about philosophy a long time ago, and he's what kind of got me more geeked out into philosophy stuff. So awesome that he got some feedback here on the show. But I think the term that stood out to me, because he had a lot of really good information in there, but, like, you know, the data that sample size, the things that signal you to whether or not something may or may not be significant or plausible. So the signals to me is kind of what stood out for there, because again, his analogy of like putting dog crap in a beer, like, really, if you serve that to 3 people and all 3 come back and say, yep, it tastes like shit. Pardon my language. You know,
literally,
obviously, yeah, obviously you're going to probably take their word for it. Whereas, you know, some of these things, 20, I think it's a good sample size. Again, none of these things are, totally objective, right? Because we're not putting them under a gas chromatograph, we're not putting them under a microscope. But for this tasting, this perception testing, I think 20 is a good one. And if I remember correctly, you've talked a lot about how 20 is a lot of what industry people say is correct in this kind of study.
I mean, I'm not going to pretend that I've like surveyed all of these sensory analysis or analysts, but I have talked to quite a handful. And for our purposes, both statisticians and people who work specifically in sensory analysis have confirmed that, yeah, 20 is actually, for what we're doing, again, 20 is really good, a good, sample size for the triangle test for what we're testing. But the thing is, and I want to get this out there, I understand the cries of many who are saying, get more, maybe something will come out of it if you get more. We have to balance, and you know this all too well at this point, Will, is that we have to balance the investment of time and work that we're doing for this thing with how meaningful it really is going to be. And so 20 is what we settled on. When I first started the experiment series, we were going with 15 because that's what a sensory analyst told me would be good for what we were doing. And so we upped that by 5 as a way to kind of, I mean, I hate to use this word negatively, but to appease the people who are complaining about it. So we're comfortable with the 20 and so that, yeah, anyways.
Well, and I think 20 is a good number for us, but I mean, you know too well as well that whenever you're out there, somehow as soon as you need data and you got a deadline you need to get this data by, like suddenly getting 20 people to drink your beer gets really hard for some stupid reason. And so like the time investment and you know, we are kind of like garage scientists. I'm not pretending to be a lab scientist at all. But I do think there is some legitimacy to what we're doing. And I think the fact that we even have p-values as part of our statistics kind of shows that. And I think what we're doing, we're doing good work, and I think what we're putting out there is, you know, maybe not total scientific lab grade study, but I think what we're doing is some solid stuff that you can get some signals as to whether or not something may yield, you know, a significant result or not.
Yeah, whether it has an impact. And that was the whole point. So first off, Curtis, I'm really glad that Will inspired you to join our Patreon. We appreciate Will. We love you, bud. And we also appreciate you doing that. It is through the Patreons that we're able to keep doing what we do so regularly. Now, as far as my training in psychology, I've certainly done my fair share of statistics, which has included 2.5 years minimum of actual classes, academic classes on statistics specifically, one of which was at the graduate school, 1 whole year. Oh boy, that was fun, of graduate level statistics, as well as performing actual psychological experiments that require statistical analyses. Now, again, like Curtis said, these are, you know, the field of mental health, as much as many of my colleagues would like to argue this, is wildly subjective. We rely on subjective reports. You can't measure things like depression or schizophrenia outside of scales where people report how they're feeling. Or what they're experiencing at the very least. That's just how this field works. So, and I'm telling you, dissertations are no joke. They all involve stats. So, but even with that, I never considered myself some sort of a stats expert. And that's why I always reached out to others who I view as being, or who are actual, you know, experts in stats or in subjective analyses and stuff like that, sensory analysis. But my fascination has always been with the human condition, particularly perception. And statistics just happens to provide the best avenue for better understanding that kind of stuff on a more, I'm hesitant to use this word, but on a more objective level. That doesn't mean it's ever totally objective, though. That's exactly why we use the triangle test, though. So, this relies on a one-tailed binomial proportions test, which is a stat. Okay. And that's what we do with brewlosophy. We've never been interested in answering questions with fact, but rather investigating the perceptual impact certain variables might have on beer. There are going to be times where maybe there's a false positive, maybe there's a false negative, and that's why we replicate and replicate and replicate. I can't tell you how many times we've readdressed certain variables using different styles and in different, small changes, but different conditions. If I'm being frank, I live in a world of equivocalness. That's just how I am, meaning I view most, but not all things with some level of skepticism. And so it's funny to me when people make the presumption that we or I am claiming something as hard fact when I don't even view the world that way, but it's easy to kind of elucidate that from what we write. So I get it. It doesn't bother me. I'm an ENFJ. If anybody wants to know, things don't bother me that much. So if I've learned anything over the 2 decades I've been studying human psychology, it's that people tend to prefer absolutes and want hard answers, which is something, again, I just don't share. And, I know it's weird, but I sort of like not knowing things. It gives us something to explore and to look at. And even being wrong about things at times, I find kind of fun. I don't know. And if I've learned anything in the nearly decade that I've been running Brewlosophy, it's that a lot of brewers are just like every other human. We're just as susceptible to biases and cognitive fallacies, and we get just as defensive when we're told something that we've wholeheartedly adopted as, quote, the right way, and put effort into employing in our brewing practices may not be all that necessary. It all makes sense to me, which I suppose is why I don't mind when people call us out. Either way, Curtis, I genuinely appreciate your comment and your support. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. All right, if you've yet to experience the awesomeness that is the Brewlosophy Show, go check it out right now. You can pause this episode, open up your web browser, go to youtube.com/@thebrewlosophy Show, or you can even just search for Brewlosophy on YouTube. Martin is absolutely killing it. In fact, in the 9 months since dropping our first episode, we've already gained over 18,000 subscribers, and our latest episode, which was released less than 2 weeks ago, has already cracked 20,000 views. From what I can tell, that's pretty impressive. And in my opinion, a sign of the quality content Martin really is producing. Just trust me, you're going to love it. The Brewlosophy Show, good stuff. All right, when we're back from this break, our focus will be on Spelt Malt.
Chilling work can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Exchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brewlosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Exchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Exchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to exchillerator.com today. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts.
Of the hundreds of batches of beer I've brewed over the last 20 years or so, I've used various types of barley malt, wheat malt, rye malt, as well as flaked cereal grains, all of which are purported to contribute something unique to the finished product. One thing I've never used is spelt malt, which, at least to my memory, really started to gain traction among brewers in the last, 4 or 5 years. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of this unique malt, let's spend a minute talking about what exactly spelt is.
Okay, so what is spelt? Well, if you are to believe something known as Wikipedia, it's a species of hulled wheat that has been cultivated since approximately 5,000 BCE. I believe it originated in Mesopotamia 10,000 years ago, but I guess cultivation was a little bit later. And then genetic evidence shows that spelt is a naturally occurring hybrid of domesticated wheat and wild goat grass. Another cool fact is I think it found its way to Germany about 3,000 years ago in the Bronze Age. And it doesn't seem to need the same soil nutrient requirements that modern wheat has. So it's a little bit less picky about where it grows, which may explain why it spread out so fast.
Yeah, I read that as well. I mean, this is, I am by no means a grain expert or a malt expert. So I did some reading about this as we were preparing for this episode. And I did not realize that spelt malt, or spelt in general, which is very simple. It is actually, I think we need to clarify that it is actually a species of wheat. So we have to distinguish what type of wheat we typically use for brewing, and then the type of wheat that we're referring to today, which is actually called spelt. I didn't even realize that the wheat that we use for cooking and brewing is actually referred to as bread wheat. I didn't know that until I was researching this episode. I always just called it wheat. And yeah, so there are different species, and spelt is one of them. And like you said, I thought it was pretty interesting actually that because of its lack of need for as much nutrients in the soil, a lot of cultures ended up cultivating it and growing it because they didn't have to fertilize as much, and it didn't sap their soil of as much nutrients or something like that. I thought it was pretty interesting. So it really is a more hardy, if you will, a type of a grain. And it was introduced to the United States in the late 19th century. So not very long ago, considering how old this stuff is. I mean, 5,000 BCE, that is a long time ago. But it was soon replaced by bread wheat. And, however, like we were talking about, since it requires less fertilizer than bread wheat, we're seeing kind of an increase in its use in the cooking world because of the whole organic farming movement. People who don't want to have to use fertilizers as much. This stuff is a little bit hardier, and so they can grow it better. But yeah, it is a common wheat substitute for like artisanal bread, pasta, and of course, as we're doing, using it in beer as kind of a replacement for wheat, and even in some cases, barley. So we talked about spelt there, but let's break down a little bit what spelt malt is and go, not too deeply into the malting process, because I do think that's interesting.
Well, real quick. So you talk about spelt and baking. I remember in Germany, they call it dinkel. And so you would see dinkel flour at the grocery store when I lived there. And so like you could actually buy spelt flour at the store, where I think here you have a little bit harder time finding it. So
I saw that as well. And it's not even, I mean, you lived in Germany, so you had, direct access there, but pretty much in apparently most European countries, it's a far more common option than it is here in the United States. And so it does make you wonder, at least me, that you've got these notably, beer centric cultures like in Germany, where there's and particularly wheat beers, Weiss beer. Were they, when they started making those, maybe they were using spelt because it's just a different species of wheat. So we don't have necessarily the deepest of records on this, or I'm just an idiot and haven't found them, which is probably more true. But it does make you wonder, like, how often it has, or how much was this being used in the production of beer? I don't know. I think it's interesting.
Right. Okay. So yeah, but back to your question, what is spelt malt, right? So there is a malting process that it goes through, but it starts out as a raw spelt where, and some people actually desire raw spelt. I know there's some brewers out there that are seeking out raw spelt for like more kind of farmhouse ales and saisons and things like that. But for most of us, we're looking for the malted variety. And so they're going to steep that in water for a couple of days, and then the enzymes are going to activate, and ultimately you're going to lead to some sprouting, and evidenced by visible acrospire coming out of the kernel. And so, and then after that, the water's then removed and is chitted spelt, and then goes into the germination process where it undergoes modification, where protein and carbohydrates break down and the starches reserves are opened up, and that can take about 4 to 5 days.
Yeah, so the whole malting process is the same for any grain. There was a company, I don't know if they're still around, but 5 or 6 years ago, they contacted me and they were making actual home like malting systems, kind of like we have home breweries. And their thing was like, if you have access to raw barley or wheat or whatever, this makes it, you basically can replicate what these big maltsters are doing right in your garage. I thought it was pretty cool, but they explained to me, I was asking like, so what do you use it for? I'm an idiot, like I said, and they were like, oh, it's so much for more than so much than barley. You can use it. You can use corn. You can do all of the things that we brew with. Basically, you can malt because it's essentially the same exact process. So yeah, the acrospire, you get it wet, you soak it, and malting is this basic kind of 3-step process. So there's the soaking, or the steeping is what they refer to it as, and then there's the germination period, and that's where this chitted malt. If you've ever heard of chit malt, that's the malt that still has that acrospire sticking out apparently. But yeah, and so about a week into it now, you're taking this germinated spelt and you're drying it in a kiln. And this process not only kind of halts that germination process, but it also adds color and ostensibly flavor, right? It's going to contribute that toasty, what we associate with a nice, dry, kilned base malt, and it's going to add that as well. So spelt malt is basically the easiest way to think about it, in my opinion, is basically wheat malt, but there's one notable difference, and I'm sure you're already thinking about what it is, Will, and that's that spelt malt has a very hard hull on it, whereas wheat, the hull is removed so easily that when we're brewing with wheat malt, there's no hull on it like there is with barley. With spelt malt, there usually is, and so that's something you need to keep in mind. The hull is a little bit thicker. Again, I've never actually brewed with this stuff, but from what I've read, it's a bit thicker and a little bit tougher to deal with. But by milling it, you're all good. You shouldn't have to worry about things like a stuck sparge like you would if you were brewing with 100% wheat malt, because those hulls are there and they're serving the same purpose as they would with. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, Will, but as barley malt.
So I'm gonna fall on the sword here a little bit, because I'm the one that I think sent you down this path, and I did a lot of research, and it is like noted in several articles like a husked wheat variety, husk, but it does appear, like from reading different things, and I watched probably 20 minutes of Environment Malt videos, shamelessly.
You're an expert now. That's the deal. Yeah, right? 20 minutes makes you an expert.
My Google degree, and so it does appear that similar to wheat, the husk does fall off, unfortunately. So I may have like sent you down a rabbit hole there that you did need to go down. So that's totally my bad. I'll fall on that sword.
Well, I'll tell you what, it's not all your fault, Will. One, I lack the experience of using this stuff. So, whatever, I'm going in blind. But I did read, what I did is I went and I looked at various different maltsters, many of them craft maltsters, and some of them actually list it as being a hulled rusk wheat, type of wheat. So it does have a hull. So depending on where you get it, I think it may make a difference. It would make sense to me if a company as big as Vireman basically treated it the same way they do wheat. And apparently it doesn't take much to get the husk off. It's not like a big task, but just to be, when you're going to use this stuff, pay attention to whether it's on there or not. Because to me, the main thing that's going to determine is, well, okay, if there's no hull, do I need to use rice hulls, or what percentage do I want to use in my beer, right? Because it can get, if you've ever made a wheat beer or a beer with a large amount of rye malt, you know what I'm talking about. It can actually stop, you can get a stuck sparge or a stuck lauter and it sucks.
Yeah, that's 100% true. So, Marshall, what kind of specifications can we expect from Spelt Malt if I were to go buy some online for more beer today?
The information about Spelt Malt is still fairly slim online compared to other, more commonly used brewing grains. But what I found is that it has a similar diastatic power and points per pound per gallon, or PPG, as wheat malt. And it makes sense because it is a species of wheat. So it can technically be used as a base malt because it is capable of self-conversion once it goes through that malting process. Now, as an aside, there are obviously other forms that spelt comes in. It's not all just malted. You can buy flaked spelt. You can buy, basically, just replace spelt with wheat. You can get all the same types, right, as what you can find wheat in. So it tends to be kilned to between 1.5 and 3.0 degrees Lovabond, give or take, maybe some a little higher, some a little lower. But yeah, spec wise, it's gonna be basically like wheat malt, and so you kind of have to use it like you would wheat malt, which there will be people who contend, and I guess on a technical level, this is true, that you can brew a beer with 100% wheat malt. The problem becomes the higher protein and the lack of a hull makes it very difficult to lauter. And so it can create some technical issues with the brewing process, but you can get away with doing that and hitting the numbers that you're predicting because of that. And I believe Spelt is the same way.
Yeah, I think if you're going above 20, 30% rice hulls, they're definitely a good idea, especially if you don't brew in a bag and you use like a more traditional cooler setup or something like that.
Sure.
It's really cool because, most of the spelt, maybe not unironically, because again, it's way more popular in Germany than here, but most of the spelt that you can find online from like more beer is like German maltsters. Like you said, there are some smaller maltsters, but I guess Vireman, like in one of the videos I was watching, I didn't see it on their website today. I could have just missed it, but they used to have like chocolate spelt they made. So they kilned it all the way up to have like a chocolate spelting malt, kind of like their chocolate rye that they have. And so, that's kind of a curious thing, like what would chocolate spelt impart? But I guess that's a different idea and a different show.
Well, all they're doing is roasting the malted grain usually. And in the case of like roasted barley, if they were to make a roasted spelt, they probably wouldn't even malt it first because you don't need to. You're killing off all of that, enzymes and all that stuff anyways. So, but yeah, depending on certain factors, you look at spelt and you're like, well, it's basically the same thing as wheat. And I guess that's why we're looking into it now is what does it really contribute to beer? Now, what it is purported to contribute and what people claim, we're going to talk about how, and at least in my experience, what I have observed, what you've observed, Will, in its rise in popularity of late. But kind of more generally, it is said to contribute a sweet and nutty flavor to beer. So, and in my reading, that was pretty consistent, but I think that's relative to barley malt. I don't think people are comparing it necessarily to just wheat malt. They're saying that when you use spelt malt, upwards of like 60% of the grain bill, I believe, that it will contribute this kind of sweet, nutty. I always think of remember that old cereal commercial Nut and Honey in the
Yeah.
80s. I always think that, right? It was that like sweet, nutty kind of thing that you would get. And I've had, to me, when I hear sweet and nutty, I think of honey malt, which is a far cry from what we're talking about here in Spelt Malt. But that to me sounds very pleasant. Like I would want that in beer. It also can contribute, and to me, this sounds a little weird, hints of clove and spice. Some people will note that by using higher amounts of Spelt Malt, you can get that. To me, if I'm tasting clove, I'm thinking phenols, and my brain will automatically presume like an off flavor or some sort of a contamination. That from my reading was compared to standard wheat malt. This whole idea of like clove and spice versus with Spelt Malt versus wheat malt. But again, I've never used it, and in the beers that I've had that have been made with Spelt Malt, I've never tasted clove or spice. What about you, Will?
No, I get the sweet and nutty potentially, like, and again, I agree with you. I think that's definitely comparing it to barley malt per se, because it didn't like taste like, I didn't like, chew on a piece or drink my beer and say, ooh, this is sweet and nutty. But I think it's definitely like not that honey malt kind of things. But like clove, I don't really get that, so to speak. Like to me, that would maybe that's kind of a byproduct. I know it's used in a lot of kind of farmhouse styles, or maybe kind of as a replacement for wheat. So maybe that's a different byproduct that people are just associating with it because of the beer styles it's used. But what I also think is interesting is that, for more modern styles, is that it does, like wheat, have that higher protein content.
Yeah.
That we're looking for body, haze stability, those kinds of things. But it's also lower in gluten than wheat, which is kind of fascinating. And so I don't think it's for the gluten intolerant people that have celiacs. I don't think this is for you because it still does contain gluten.
Yeah.
But if maybe if you have gluten sensitivity and reduced gluten in your beers is helpful, maybe this is an option. But I know it's not gluten free. That's for sure.
Well, yeah, and I really like what you said about the fact that maybe there's an association. I mean, again, this is my wheelhouse here. Is the way perception works, right? It's so far from perfect. I'll tell you that. But that wheat. Or that spelt is often a replacement for wheat malt, and that wheat malt is often used in styles like saison or whatever like that. And maybe there is some association that people make with that. I also wonder if rye malt, people often explain as having a spicy characteristic to it that I am wholly convinced comes from the association of rye malt with certain types of bread that actually have different spices in it, we'll say, that, that kind of make us, when we think of rye malt, we think of this, when I've had rye bread, well, that spiciness in rye bread is not coming from rye malt, I promise. So I wonder about that as well, that, okay, they're looking at Spelt Malt, and it does kind of look like rye malt a little bit, I guess. Rye malt is far smaller than Spelt Malt, but, and you kind of like, it's different, so it must contribute something unique. I don't know. But the one, when I think of wheat malt in particular, the characteristic that my brain kind of associates with that, because wheat is used to make bread, is fresh bread or doughy, or stuff like descriptors like that. So that's why we do these experiments, I think, is because, or part of what contributes to our desire to do these, is we want to suspend the bias that we have and that other people have had in describing these things, and really try to see what comes through when we don't know, when the people we're serving these to don't know. So, but like you said, it does have a higher protein content, and this will be a little aside because we're not focusing on hazy IPA today, but my understanding is that's part of the reason that a lot of people who are into the hazy IPA thing started to adopt Spelt Malt, was because it has that higher protein content, which does contribute to a more luscious, cloudy mouthfeel and potential haze stability. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's some other reason that it got popular, but the people that I saw who were using it more often, in fact, I think it was Scott Janish who I first heard talk about this stuff, are heavily invested in the hazy IPA thing.
Yeah, I do think like, of beer styles that are out there in America, like hazy IPA, it does make sense because people are looking for something to give it a little wrinkle that's not malted wheat per se, or, more traditional like flaked oats that people have been using in hazy IPA. So I do see that like Spelt could give it a wrinkle. And then, anything that's producing better haze and foam I mean, obviously guys like Scott Janish are going to be all over it. So
yeah, exactly. So we've talked about the characteristics one might expect to get from Spelt Malt based on existing descriptors that are out there. But let's talk about using Spelt Malt because, well, it's not much different than if you're using wheat malt, right? That's my understanding. It can be used like any other base malt. But from what I've read, I think Vireman is the one who recommends a max usage rate of 60% of the grain bill, something like that.
Yeah, so the two biggest maltsters that you're going to find with Spelt Malt that at least for homebrewers that I found easily available where you're not buying like 50 plus pounds at a time are Vireman and Best Malts.
Yeah.
And those are and it makes sense. Like it's very popular in Germany. Obviously it's easy for them to like kind of already be in this because it's I think Baden-Württemberg is the region in Germany where it's like really popular to grow spelt still. And even Best Malt says up to 60% is probably the max usage that they recommend. So that makes a lot of sense for both of them. But I guess that the big thing here that you want to ask is, are you getting something like from Best Malts or Fireman that has no hull? Or are you getting something more custom that has a hull? Because that will, as we mentioned earlier and alluded to earlier, create some decisions you need to make in your process of using rice hulls. Maybe you want to, if you're using an all-in-one, maybe you want to put this in a brew bag inside just so you got something to squeeze on later whenever everything gets kind of gelatinous in there.
Yeah.
So definitely be aware of those things whenever you're buying this and just kind of spec it out as best you can.
I believe it was our friend James Spencer from Basic Brewing Radio who many years ago did I'm thinking about like, why wouldn't we do a 100% spelt malt beer? He did, I think it was a 100% rye malt beer. And I think his description of the lautering process was that it was like trying to lauter snot or something like that. It was the beta glucans in or no husk rye malt really made it difficult for lautering, and brewing a bag makes it possible, but it still is very, very thick. I made a beer with rye malt one time that was like, I think it was only like 40 or 50% rye malt, and it was so viscous, that wort. So that is something. Now I don't know what the beta glucan content in spelt is. I'm certain it's nowhere near as high as rye malt. But if it doesn't have that husk, I wonder if that's not why Vireman and Best Malts make that recommendation. Is because hey, you got to treat it like you do wheat malt, and we know what kind of problems can be created if you're trying to lauter with a high percentage of wheat malt. It's the same as spelt malt. So we talked a little bit about beer styles to use this in, but to me the first thing that comes to mind, only because of what I mentioned recently, is this whole hazy IPA thing. It does contribute kind of purportedly at least more haze stability, better foam quality because of the higher protein content, which you blend that with the massive late hopping and hazy IPA. It makes sense to me that people would want that because it's going to contribute that nice creamy, or help to contribute to a nice creamy foam, that nice haze stability, kind of what people expect in their hazy IPA. But there are other styles where this is a very appropriate grain to use.
Right. So what's funny is you think hazy, and whenever I was doing, my research on spelt to begin with, I think more kind of like Saison and farmhouse ales in general kind of came up overwhelmingly over and over again. And why not? Because this has been a very traditional malt in Europe for a very long time. It wasn't just in Germany. We talked about Germany because that's where they're malting it today.
Right.
But this thing spread all across Europe. And so I think it'd be pretty cool, to have some raw spelt farmhouse ales going on with some of these more traditional processes. And that's kind of where I think of initially as well. But I know probably Weissbier and some other stuff are out there as well.
Yeah, Weissbier, Saison, those ones are all very commonly, spelt malt is commonly used, or spelt in general, commonly used in those. But the one that I just think it's used so often, of course, is British ale, right?
Of course. In fact, if you read what Chat GPT has to say about this, it says you could create a unique variation of the style, and that you should this should be done thoughtfully to ensure that it complements the style.
That's right.
ChatGPT was like, you could do it, but really?
So when we design experiments, we do try to tailor the beer style to the variable without getting too much in the way of what the impact of that variable might be. In this case, we wanted something that was crisp, clean, drinkable. Usually we might go with a pale lager or something like that, but in this case we went with a British Golden Ale. We're not going to spend too much time focusing on this, but because in the next segment, the experiment that we talk about is focused on a British Golden Ale, we can talk a little bit about what we might expect Spelt Malt to do in that. Again, British Golden Ale is not like an old school style. It's a relatively modern British style that was developed, I believe, in the 80s is kind of what the purported development of this style is, just to compete with popular commercial lagers of the time. I can imagine these brewers in the 80s are like in England are like, God, Carlsberg is getting so popular, or Budweiser or whatever it is. We need to have something that locals at least want to drink that's going to make us some money, right? That's going to sell here and competes with these lagers. So they came up with British Golden Ale. It's a little bit more hop forward, really average strength, pale bitter. That's refreshing. It's drinkable. I absolutely love the style, and it is different than a typical pale lager, but it has a lot of the same drinkability characteristics. It's attenuated, crisp, clean, drinkable, all of that. So it can be made with a portion of wheat malt, and that is something that I believe even the BJCP notes that flaked adjunct and or wheat malt type of thing. And so using spelt malt in this style now at the rate that we used is probably very uncommon, but we were testing something out. So I don't know. To me, it sounds like it would work, and we're not expecting it to contribute all this clove and spice character necessarily. We're expecting it to act somewhat like wheat malt.
Well, and when you look at spelt malt, it's supposed to add a creamier mouthfeel, like a nicer head retention. And who doesn't want that in their British Golden Ale? Let's just be honest.
Yeah, totally. So I've actually had a variety of beer styles that I know were made with at least some portion of spelt malt, including hazy IPA, Weissbier, and Saison. I've never had a British Golden Ale made with spelt malt that I'm aware of, but to my palate, it honestly tasted no different than the same styles made with wheat malt, and even some made without wheat malt, just barley malt. So, I wasn't doing side-by-side comparisons in those. So, Will, you were curious what impact spelt malt has when used in a British Golden Ale, and you put it to the test. Results from that experiment when we're back from this break. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. After water, grains are the most prominent ingredient in beer, so it makes sense that brewers would be interested in the perceptible impact different types of grain have. While technically a member of the wheat family, many believe spelt malt contributes its own unique characteristics, which is what we hope to flesh out in a recent experiment you performed, Will.
Yes. So, what impact does spelt malt have on a British Golden Ale? And so, to get this going, we did 2 5-gallon batches of British Golden Ale, and I did these on my Delta Brewing System all-in-one units. One batch was made with 100% Maris Otter, while the other one was made with 67% Maris Otter and about 33% spelt malt. There was some rounding in there because nobody wants to hear 32.6 or 33.1. So there we go. We got some rounding.
So was there, before we move on though, was there a reason? Cause we just talked about how the manufacturers recommend upwards of 60% as a max usage rate. Was your thinking with 33% just that, because I know, we discuss all of these things ahead of time, but there are certain things where we have an idea ahead of why we want to go with the proportions that we do. And in past experiments, we've usually stuck with like 25 to 35% of the malt that we're testing out. Did you have any, underlying kind of thoughts about why to go with this proportion of spelt malt?
So I wanted to go upwards of 30%. It just so happens that 3.5 pounds was 32.6% or whatever the actual percentage was. And so that was kind of my thinking, is I definitely want to go upwards of 30%. That seemed pretty reasonable for this style of beer, and also seemed like a pretty reasonable place to start. Now, if we do another spelt experiment, depending on how this one turns out, maybe we go higher, maybe we go lower, depending on what the results are of this one. But this seemed like a pretty good starting spot because it was right there in the middle of that recommended usage.
Yeah, so similar to wheat malt in styles like this, when it's not the feature malt, what I saw, I went and I reviewed a whole bunch of Brewfather recipes that had spelt in them, and I mean, obviously they fell on the three styles that I saw were hazy IPA, saison, and Weiss beer. And so the typical usage rate when people are using it for the purposes of, body, mouthfeel, and head retention with contributing some form of, flavor from it is about 15%. So you actually did double what I, saw to be what seems to be at least the typical usage rate. So I thought this was pretty solid choice there.
Yeah, I didn't want to go like totally off the rails, but I did want to push boundaries pretty consistently, and 33% may be a little bit off the rails, but at least we're still close to the tracks. So,
I think it's great. Yeah.
So continue on. Part of the process is I mashed both beers at 152 Fahrenheit or 67 C. And then when the 60-minute mash rests were complete, I removed the grains, sparged to collect identical pre-boil volumes, and then both worts were boiled for 60 minutes. For this one, I did a 32 grams of Cascade at 30 minutes, 14 grams of Willamette at 15 minutes, and then I did kind of a 1 minute flame out-ish addition of 20 grams of Cascade Lupo at 1 minute. So pretty light actual hop regime there for a British Golden Ale. Like I definitely could have gone hoppier if we were not trying to accent this variable. So
yeah, well, and that's the thing about British Golden Ale is that you think of British ale and you don't think of super hoppy outside of IPA, but even like English IPA isn't like super duper hoppy like an American IPA would be. But British Golden Ale really is. It's one of the odd features. I mean, in a very good way, odd features of that style is that it does tend to have a really nice hop character to go with that nice well attenuated pale British ale.
Yeah, and anytime you can use Maris Otter with kind of more American New World hops, it's going to be a good day. So
hell yeah,
at least in my opinion. So after the boil, I chilled my wort for both batches, and then I racked them into my kegmenters. I think the OG for the Spelt Malt was 1.045, 1045, and then the all barley malt was 1.046.
People will be like, oh, that means the barley malt is hotter or whatever. This may very well be a function of just the different brewing processes. As precise as we aim to be, and as you are, Will, sometimes stuff like this just happens. It could be something, whatever. It could just be a conversion issue. And to me, it may very well also be because of the spelt malt. But one specific gravity point difference, I mean, we're splitting hairs there. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, and these are two different, they're the same system. They're Delta all-in-one brewing systems, but they're two different systems. I'm doing two batches with a 30-minute stagger. And so could there be some variability that this one might go a smidge hotter or this one might do? Yeah, sure. We're measuring all this stuff out. We're trying to be as precise as we can. But I think that's well within a margin of error that's acceptable to me. So
amen. Yeah. Yep. Agreed.
So I filled the fermenters. I placed them in I have a nice little upright freezer that I use as a fermentation chamber, and I let them sit at 66F. And then I pitched a pouch of Imperial Yeast A09 Pub, which is just a beautiful yeast for this style. That fuller strain, right? So it's going to be pretty good. And then after a week of fermentation, I kind of started to raise the temp up to about 70F and then left it on for another week before I started taking hydrometer measurements. So
yeah, and because we're talking about a British ale here, we're gonna do the thing where 66F is 19C, 70F is 21C for those out there who are getting confused. Yeah. So yeah, typical British ale fermentation with one of my favorite yeasts of all time, Imperial Yeast A09 Pub. At this point, you're looking and saying, all right, well, they're basically the same. One has 33% spelt malt, the other has all barley malt. We're all good. I do wonder though, oftentimes, the OG, like we talked about, yeah, one SG difference, but there are certain malts where, to me, the more meaningful data is attenuation and how far, that how low that FG got. Is the spelt malt batch going to attenuate as well as the non-spelt malt batch? And what I'm looking at in the pictures on the article page right now is that the spelt malt finished at 1009 FG. The non-spelt malt batch, the all Maris Otter batch, finished at 1010, which, considering the spelt malt batch started one OG lower than the barley malt batch, is the same attenuation. So in my book, I'm looking and saying, all right, we got similar numbers here. These beers are essentially the same by the numbers so far, and so we're off to a good start there, because what it's showing, and maybe you're getting something else out of this, but what it's showing is that that these malts kind of act the same when used in a style like a British Golden Ale, at least.
I'm actually pretty floored by this result, because I know for me personally, I have a lot of issues where I start to use adjuncts like wheat and rye. And sometimes when we're doing these side-by-side barley to, some 30% adjunct beer, like a lot of times you won't get the same attenuation, and you won't, like, things just behave differently. And so this is pretty awesome, and kind of, it's only one data point, only one place for this, but like it kind of, to me, like makes you want to reach for spelt a little more often, just because it does have that similar fermentation characteristic to barley.
Yeah, but again, these are by the numbers. So this is no sensory so far, but so far it's looking like it does act, similarly as barley malt. I think that's pretty interesting finding.
No, I think it's awesome. So after the beers are done fermenting at this point, they're cold crashed, pressure transferred into CO2 purged kegs, and placed in my kegerator, where they were allowed to condition for a week before they were ready for evaluation.
All right. So the first thing we do when we evaluate these beers is we pour them in glasses for ourselves and we look at them. Interesting findings on the appearance bit, in my opinion, because I would not have expected the spelt malt batch to look that much different. Maybe a little bit hazier, but in terms of color and foam quality and all of that, what was it you were seeing with your very eyes, Will? Because you were the one who saw these IRL in real life, whereas I'm just looking at a picture on the internet.
Well, the spelt malt batch was definitely lighter, like from the hydrometer samples all the way into the kegs. Like the spelt malt batch was just a little bit paler, not enough to like really throw you off or throw you out of style or anything, but it was definitely a slightly paler than the all Maris Otter batch.
So I've made quite a few beers. I think a lot of people do this because of how incredibly good MO is, Maris Otter is. I've made quite a few single malt beers with Maris Otter, and they all look exactly like your 100% Maris Otter beer as well. They tend to have almost, it's like bordering from that border between yellow and orange, that beautiful color. The Spelt Malt beer with just 33%, which I suppose is quite a bit, but a third of that grain bill was Spelt Malt. I mean, in the picture, at least, it is obviously lighter. It's not a vast difference, but it is noticeably paler than the MO version, which speaks to the fact that it's kilned to a lower degree Lovabond, or so the EBC is lower than the Maris Otter. And so, first finding already is okay. Are we going to taste a difference because of the kilning? And I think that's different. So, what did the foam color and the head retention and all of that look like? Were you finding that just because of the claims of Spelt Malt contributing to good head and mouthfeel and all of that, were you finding that the foam quality of either of the beers was different than the other?
No, based off of the pictures and my notes, like the foam and head retention was about the same. I don't typically have problems with head retention, so
yeah,
that's not really something I tend to struggle with in my beers, and so I didn't notice like much in the way of difference in head retention and foam on these particular beers.
Yeah, it's I don't mean to go down rabbit holes here, but it's really interesting to me as we've started to test different grains and malts that are essentially marketed as being for foam quality, things like Carapils or Carafoam, that it's very difficult to prove that they really contribute much to that stuff anyways. And, people still use it for those purposes, whatever you do, but in something like Carapils, we actually, which is far different than Spelt Malt, but Carapils, after doing our experiment on that, where it seemed to actually have a negative impact on the foam, if any impact at all, we actually read that it's been determined that it's actually foam negative, which I think is quite interesting. In this case, the spelt malt just seemed to not have that impact, and it may very well be because there's a point, that there's like a threshold where it needs to contribute to the foam quality, and both of your beers, it just didn't need it. They're both already had good foam quality because of your brewing process and ingredients anyways. So we're not saying that it's not gonna help with foam. We're saying that in this case, it didn't seem to have any impact on that.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, proteins, like higher proteins, obviously help with, scientifically are known to help in a objective test that that you're going to get better head retention. So but again, it just depends. It could be that maybe my base malt had plenty of proteins in there, so it didn't really matter. So it's hard to say. But then the best part was I got to drink these beers myself and subject myself to my own triangle tests, because that's where the fun happens. And I did 7 triangle tests, and I correctly chose it 5 times. And the reason I did 7 was because I literally had trouble telling it apart the first couple of times, and then by the time I got to about the 3rd cup, that I picked up on some little, it wasn't like overtly astringent, otherwise I would have picked it up initially, but like there was like this slight astringency maybe from the all barley malt beer that was absent from the version with spelt. And then after I kind of picked that out on my palate, like I was able just to hammer it every time. But it wasn't, I mean, these are both delicious beers. They're both incredibly delicious. So it's not like they were night and day different. It was just this little slight thing. And once I figured out on my palate where I was picking that up, I was able to just pick it out 5 times in a row.
Yeah. And the reason I hate sharing our own personal impressions, which is, I understand, is like 99.9% of what like brewing websites and blogs and such are about, is because people hear us use certain terms and some have a tendency to latch onto that. Correct me if I'm wrong, Will. You're not saying that the 100% Maris Otter batch was astringent. You're saying that of the differences, the very, very subtle thing that you barely even noticed was that it seemed the batch made without spelt had something akin to a slight astringency compared to the one made with spelt malt. Not that it was astringent. And I think that's a really important thing for us to lay out there. I've made, again, many, many batches with 100% Maris Otter and similar hopping rates as you used in this, and they weren't astringent. They're delicious. So, but for you, that difference was that tiny little, we'll call it a signal, that you picked up there.
Exactly. I would not call it an astringent beer. I've had astringent beers. This is not what I would say this beer was astringent. It was, again, this little spot that just kind of, I don't know, made one part of my palate kind of tickle, pucker, whatever you want to call astringency, and it wasn't like my whole mouth. It wasn't like, it was just one little very subtle part of my palate that actually reacted to it. And so it was not astringent at all. It was just one little thing that I was able to pick out after trying them a couple of times. So if it was astringent, I would have picked it out on the first triangle test, not the 3rd.
Exactly. Well, and this is exactly why we serve the triangle test to blind tasters, is because we could easily say, oh, well, out of 7, I got it right. And so here's what I'm going to go tell the whole world now. And this is why you should or shouldn't use spelt malt. No, we don't do that. That's very intentional on our part. You ended up serving the triangle test with these 2 beers to 20 participants. Hey, there's that number again. Wherein you would have to have 11 accurately identify the unique sample in order for us to say that there was a significant finding, that there's some sort of a meaningful or seemingly meaningful difference between these beers based on the variable. And in the end, how many people actually were able to identify the odd beer out?
Only 7 people were able to identify, and that was just around 35%. We would have needed 11 for a significant result, and so this was a not significant result.
And the thing to keep in mind here, first off, I try to explain this every once in a while, that the way the triangle test works, it's triangle, meaning there's 3 beers. So a lot of people will say, oh, but if 50% of people get, no, it just enough people over 1/3, which 1/3 would be random chance. If you're selecting each one randomly, you'd expect, out of 21 people, you'd expect 7 each, give or take, to pick each sample, right? You need just enough over 1/3 for us to start saying, okay, there's something more going on here that we can't really explain with random chance. It does seem like there's something different enough that people are able to reliably distinguish these beers. In this case, you were right around that 1/3 mark, which indicates that this is no better than random guessing. And that's how this statistic works. That's not to say it didn't have an impact at all. We do not allow tasters, we very intentionally, I should say, we very intentionally cover up the appearance of these beers. If you had served these beers in a triangle test, let's say you gave 2 of the Spelt Malt beers and 1 of the all MO beers in clear glasses, probably, I mean, some people struggle with their vision. So we'll say that probably 95% of people, based on the way they look alone, would have been able to identify the odd beer out. And that's not what we're measuring. We want to know, is there an impact on the aroma, flavor, and mouthfeel that people can reliably detect based on the variable that we are employing? So in this case, what we can say is that it doesn't seem that 33% Spelt Malt in a British Golden Ale had a perceptible impact. Yes, it absolutely had an impact on the color of the beer, but in what you're telling us is it didn't seem to affect the foam quality. People couldn't tell it apart based on aroma, flavor, and mouthfeel. So in the end, these beers were far more similar than they were different in those qualities. The one place where they weren't was in the color.
100%. Like the color is the most obvious difference, but everything else, like, again, even though I was able to peg it a little bit, like, they tasted basically the same. So I have absolutely, I'm not surprised at this result, basically off my experience, and obviously the tasters, the results are in. So, maybe if we went up closer to that 60% threshold, I guess we'd have to do like a Weiss beer or something. And at that point, there's so little barley malt in there, who knows? Maybe you'd have to do a Weiss beer to Weiss beer comparison there. I'm not sure, but maybe if we went up to 60%, it would shine through a little more. Maybe if we change from Maris Otter over to a Pilsner malt to do something a little different, maybe it would show up there as well. It's just hard to know, but at least we know based off of this that in this experiment with the British Golden Ale, we were unable to reach a significant result.
Yeah, and you think about it, there are going to be people out there who are saying, well, why didn't you compare it to wheat malt? Because we like to establish a baseline. And yes, you went with Maris Otter, but Maris Otter is just another typical pale malt that people brew with. It just happens to be of British origin. So we don't, it's just another pale malt. Maybe something that isn't kilned as much as Maris Otter would have created a different outcome. But personally, I'm doubtful. That doesn't matter, though. We'll have to test it out in the future. 33% Spelt Malt didn't have an impact when compared to a beer made without it. That, to me, is astounding, given how much this malt has been talked about for contributing these positive characteristics. Again, I am by no means saying don't use it. Use it if you want. I don't care. But the fact that it didn't impact the things that it's kind of marketed it as impacting, which is mouthfeel and foam quality, yeah, very, very interesting. And we've seen this kind of thing before as well. So I want to get into real quick some reader comments, in particular the first one, because I think a lot of people might be wondering the same thing. Well, if it didn't have that big of a flavor, aroma, or mouthfeel impact, if it's cheaper and it's better for the environment, then maybe it's worth growing. Well, Tom Rischel says, is there a significant difference in cost between Spelt and barley malt? If it's significantly cheaper, I'm wondering if Spelt may become a standard base malt. Now, on this comment, which he left on the article on brewlosophy.com, Will, you actually went and got the prices for Spelt Malt versus wheat malt from More Beer, sponsors of ours, great people. They sell Spelt Malt for $4.70 per pound versus wheat malt, which is $2 per pound. So to me, that's kind of the indicator there. What are you going to go with, next time you're brewing with either of these types of grains?
So yeah, there's definitely a novelty, and I can imagine they're not, if you're Environment, if you're Best Malts, if you're any malts, you're probably not producing as much malted spelt as you are malted wheat. And so there is a novelty to it. And so while it may be more environmentally friendly to grow, I'm pretty sure the laws of supply and demand are dictating some prices here where there's just not as much of the malted variety there. I'm sure probably much more of it's going into flour or some other raw usages that are more in the baking industry side of things and less on the beer side of things. And that could change over time if consumers demand it, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. And, I'm with you on this. Again, just because we've done this single experiment on Spelt Malt doesn't make us experts. But Steve Fisher says the style matters a good deal as well. In my experience, the higher protein Spelt adds a huge amount of foam and provides solid head retention. In addition, I find it to be a great substitute for wheat and cloudier beers such as hazy IPA and even Hefeweizen. And again, this is we can't say anything about the impact it has on any other style but British Golden Ale. I don't understand how using it in other styles would really, change the way it affects, these qualities in beer, but maybe it does.
Well, first off, Steve is kind of the guy that I'm assuming he's our patron, Steve Fisher, but he's kind of the guy that got me into looking into Spelt. So it's his fault. Everyone can thank him. But I'm kind of with you. Like, you know, if you went up to 50%, at which point it's a wheat beer, and so doing, I don't know, that would be kind of a different thing. But I think, you know, 30% in an all barley versus, you know, a wheat-ish adjunct comparison, I don't know, is 50, if you do it 50%, like, are you even in the barley versus, you know, wheat conversation anymore? I don't know. It just seems like pretty extreme. I am curious though, at what point is the return on investment that it does change the flavor significantly?
Exactly. And if it's going to contribute essentially the same thing, I mean, God, is barley malt versus wheat malt. Yeah, you have to ask yourself. And another thing that I'm sure people have wondered is, well, maybe if you didn't do a British Golden Ale, which is known for being a bit hoppier, who knows? We can't tell based on this data. What we can say is that in this particular British Golden Ale, it didn't seem to have much of an impact at all. So final comment comes from Piano Man Harry, who left this on Instagram. He said, I used Spelt in my last two hazies. Head retention and foam quality were much better. So again, another person who's going in Steve's camp, saying that it does seem to have the intended effect on those qualities, foam quality and head retention. Again, I have a high degree of confidence that Piano Man Harry wasn't doing a side-by-side comparison with a version of that hazy IPA made without Spelt Malt. So do we really know? You know, I mean...
Yeah, there's some level of kind of your own personal experience, which there's nothing wrong with it. And if using Spelt, you know, maybe you are, maybe you aren't, but if you believe you're getting those results and you're happy with your beer, by all means, keep using Spelt all you want to. Like, I think it's a fantastic little tool to have in your toolbox. So just keep it back there, especially if you have kind of a beer that's a little darker and you want to lighten it up a little bit. Obviously, between the Maris Otter and the All Maris Otter and the Maris Otter with Spelt, it definitely provided some color difference, which would make it visually different and potentially more appealing depending on what you're going for. But to piggyback on something you said on the end of the last question, like you talked about like bitterness of a British Golden Ale. I remember having a discussion, I think with you, about how we dialed hop rates back a bit, because I originally had this going much hoppier to be more to style, and we actually dialed hopping rates back a little bit on this British Golden Ale, just to keep it closer to 33 IBUs, I think is where we were at, which isn't a really hoppy beer, honestly. Like, I could have done a pale ale with similar hopping rates, and so it's not like a, I mean, I understand it's not like a American light lager, but, you know, we're not talking about IPA here either. And I did enter the Spelt version into a competition, and I got a bronze, but the big complaint was like not hoppy enough for a British Golden Ale.
Yeah. Well, dude, I agree with you completely. Take from this what you will, you listeners. And if you're into Spelt Malt, keep using it if you want to. So that does bring us to the end of this episode. Don't forget to check out our newest podcast, The Brew Lab, where host Kate Jobe takes you into the lab with real brewing scientists to discuss the fascinating research they've done on our favorite beverage. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman.